Hi, welcome to the Play Typer Guy podcast. I'm Stephen Robinson, and I'm excited to welcome Georgia State Representative Ruwa Romman um, from House District 97 in Georgia. I find it frustrating that people don't understand the specific House districts and where they relate to the state. But if you don't mind telling folks about your district and yourself, and then we can, before we get started.
Absolutely. So thank you so much for having me. Really, really excited to be speaking with you today. So House District 97 is what I call like northeast-ish of Atlanta. So if you go up and down Peachtree Industrial Boulevard, that's basically my district. It's West Gwinnett. It includes Berkeley Lake, Duluth, Norcross, and Peachtree Corners, but all of Berkeley Lake, but then bits and pieces of the other ones. So if you're ever curious of where you are, we actually have a little tool on our website that you can go scroll down, put in your address, and you'll be able to look up where you are supposed to be.
Wonderful. And how long have you been in office? Because I find the story of how you got into office is sort of very cinematic, um, movie style. I find it quite charming. If you don't
Thank
mind telling
you.
folks.
It's so funny you call it charming because there are some very crazy conspiracy theorists that will say that I'm just like faking this story, but the reality is that I am up for re-election for the first time. I got elected in 2022. And the long story short of it is that I have been doing civic engagement work in Georgia for coming on 10 years now. And my main passion, my main sort of focus when it comes to politics is I want to teach people and as many people as humanly possible how to do this work. And the reason is that it's actually even gotten more so now. I see the folks who are in the hallways of the Capitol. I meet with them all the time now. And I wish that I got to meet with just my constituents, frankly, a lot more. I wish that I could hear from them a lot more. So the long story short of it is that one of the organizations that I loved volunteering for had held a candidate training, and the executive director, who's also a friend of mine, had asked me if I would attend the candidate training, and it was on Zoom. This was during COVID, and she said, "We would love your feedback to make sure we have not missed anything." And there was a reporter there who was doing a story about the importance of women and particularly minority women to run for office. And the first sentence, and so like, we did the interview. I actually remember her asking me, like, are you interested in running for office? And I said, I've been gone for about a few years, like 3 years, because I was doing my master's in public policy in DC. My husband and I just moved back. We're both the oldest. So I don't even know where I am on the map because they had just redrawn the maps again. And this was like post census. And so it wasn't even on my radar. On my radar was that I would, because this was 2021, on my radar was that I would run a marathon in 2022 and support candidates up and down the ballot for 2026 because we had the governor's race and the Senate race that year. And I don't hear from her for a few months. And then December 23rd, 2021, this is my husband and I's anniversary, my phone starts to go off. And honestly, I feel really bad because I feel like this was a omen for things to come because even on our anniversary, I could not like find peace. And it turns out the article was released, and the first sentence was something along the lines of like Ruwa Romman is considering or weighing a run for office or something like that. So people were calling me excited. They were like, "We know who you are. You've been doing this work for a long time. What can I do to help?" And I remember telling them, I was like, "I run campaigns like the back of my hand. I don't know how to fundraise to save my life, and I don't want to run for office. Like, no." And it kind of felt like they colluded a little bit because I like for a few days I just kept getting calls from people every day that are like, "You should do this. You should do this." Somebody looked up my address and found out that I'm in a new open blue seat. I had somebody who, and I love him. He's like an uncle, like second dad to me. He's known me since I was a kid, and was like, I do a lot of fundraising for nonprofits. I will just say yes, and I will make sure that you will be okay. And so 15 days later, we launched my campaign, won the primary, won the general, made history as the first Muslim woman elected to the Georgia State House and first Palestinian elected in the state, and actually most of the Southeast. So my brother, Sam Rasool, I call him my brother, but we're not actually related. But Sam Rasool is the other Palestinian elected, and he is in Virginia. So it's basically us in the region right now.
And that's amazing. I know, and I've been following you on social media. This is a pretty intense time
Yeah.
for someone of your background. Not that it was always, candy and ice cream, but
Yeah.
can you sort of speak to what what it was like? I suppose coming, as an immigrant
Yeah.
to to Georgia and growing up in Georgia as Georgia was changing, and then eventually, essentially running for office.
Yeah. So I think, you know, when I think about like my identity and how I got here, I always remind people that both sets of my grandparents were born in Palestine. Like that was all they knew. And they were forcibly and violently exiled from their homes. In fact, three of my four grandparents have now passed away without ever seeing their homes again. So personally for me, like even before politics, before everything, that was the first time, or I guess like that was sort of the first piece of my identity that I became very, very aware of, if that makes sense. And I also felt a responsibility. And it was funny because my parents were always worried about us being Palestinian kids, especially in Forsyth. And I remember like my dad would be like, "Don't tell people you're Palestinian, you know, whatever." And of course, when my parents tell me not to do something, I immediately do it. And so one day we were in class and somebody had asked, they were like, "Oh, I heard you're Palestinian." I said, "Yes." It was actually driver's ed. And the teacher had overheard it and he pulled me out into the hallway and I was like 16 or 17 at the time and he proceeded to interrogate me because he wanted to make sure I didn't have any ties to the terrorist group Hamas. That was like his phrasing. He was like, "Just got to make sure y'all are good." And I think I like remember literally laughing because I thought it was a joke. It was so absurd. But it really colored how I approach the world because it forced me to recognize a few things. One, how unjust the world is and how unjust we can be to each other. But also, two, that we can never stop trying to bring justice for everybody. And that the reality is that, like, it forced me to look around a room every time I was in a room and ask myself, who is not here?
And it reminds me, you being in Georgia, um, when I was kind of growing up in the South, um, the stories of, say, the former Confederacy and the people in the Confederacy, they would, even when explaining, okay, they were fighting for not the best cause, et
Yeah,
cetera, there
yeah,
would be a framing of empathy for, well, these troops. If you're just, a farmer and you don't understand the larger politics, you just remember troops coming in and burning your
yep,
home.
yeah,
And um, I find that perhaps growing up, as a Black person, I was meant to find that empathy for those folks that I'm not always seeing for Palestinians, because again, removing a justness of a war, what side you kind of stand on that, and whatever. Ultimately, as you're describing, these are people who have a home; they're losing their homes,
yeah.
um, and there's often not a lot of empathy for that, what you're describing.
Yeah, I mean, I tell people all the time that for my grandfather, so my grandfather taught us a few things. One of the most fundamental is that there is no homeland and there is no holy land without the Jews, the Christians, the Muslims, and the Druze, right? Like for us, and that was the world he grew up in. If you talk to Palestinians of that generation, universally, truly universally, like I remember I got to go for 2 weeks in 2019, and every person I spoke to from his generation, it was almost like you were watching a tape rerun over and over and over again. But they, you know, my grandfather's never met some of those people. And it didn't matter if I was talking to a Christian person or a Muslim person, they all said the same thing that, like, of course, it's not a utopia. Like, to be clear, when people are in the majority, they can be not great. But at the same time, the experience that my grandfather instilled in us and the policies were that this is meant to be a land for everybody. And I remember the one thing that he one time said to me, he said, I didn't even think about the soldier's faith who kicked me out of my home. Like that was never a thing that crossed his mind. What crossed his mind was, why is this happening to me? Why are you doing this to me? And am I ever going to get to come back? And unfortunately, the answer for him was no.
Yeah. Um, and what specifically, if I may ask, brought you to the American South beyond? I always sort of find it fascinating what brings people to
Yeah,
specific parts of America, because we talk about America, but as
right.
we know, the cultures are so vastly different,
Yep.
particularly in the Georgia of the late '90s, I suppose, when you arrived.
Yeah. So my dad is the youngest of his many siblings. I think he's got like 7 or 8 siblings. Which is funny because I'm the oldest. So because he and my mom are the youngest, there's like it's funny that to kind of watch our dynamic now, but his 2 brothers were here, and I remember, we were first he moved us to Egypt when I was 5, and we lived there for 2 years, and he was helping start a, cell phone company, which became huge afterwards, but he was just very restless and was young and just really wanted this sort of try something new. And he actually told us, he said he'd applied to Canada, the US, and Australia, and like paperwork and timelines and stuff. It ended up being the US where he landed. And also because his brothers were already here. So he just came and helped them with the business. And so it was one of those like family bringing family over here. But we've been in Georgia actually ever since. I briefly went to DC for grad school and then came back, but this has been home for us.
And you've talked about your experience as a, campaign, knowing how to campaign and going door to door. And I think that sort of speaks to, it's hard as of this recording, it's hard to believe that it's been not yet a month since President Joe Biden withdrew from
Yeah.
the race. Um, but within that time, a lot has occurred. I've seen polling out of Georgia where um, Kamala Harris is competitive. Biden had not been in past polls.
Yeah.
And um, could you speak to what you might have been seeing on the ground prior to Biden's withdrawal and after?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and I know people are gonna say this is just my confirmation bias, but truly and sincerely, what we saw coming out of Gaza for the past 10 to 11 months, it will hurt your soul. The reality is that seeing children separated from their families, seeing children maimed, hurt, dead, for the first time, the American public got a glimpse at Palestinians completely unfiltered, especially because so many of the people posting, they used to be your typical content creator influencer, right? Even if they were in Gaza, they would try to, like, yes, they talked about occupation, they talked about the siege, they talked about all the things they go through, but they also were sharing their day-to-day life. And that creates what I call sort of like parasocial relationships. People will do them with celebrities. It has just become a reality of our internet world. And suddenly they went from seeing these people share stories and culture and food to I'm now displaced, I'm sick. My mom was just killed, my dad was just killed. And that changes our perspective and forces us to recognize that at the other end of what we are doing are real people and people who, for the first time, get to make their asks and their feelings to us directly rather than filtered through a pundit or a news anchor or whatever the case may be. And I tell people all the time, the debate, in my personal opinion, was the straw that broke the camel's back. It was the cherry on top. I do not think that the party would have been as able to have a case about switching candidates had it not been for the polling numbers that, if you look, have genuinely cratered since November. And the reason is that we stopped the red wave, we flipped states, we did all of that because of young voters and an incredibly diverse coalition that understands the importance of caring for everybody and not just some people. And when you fundamentally break that sort of, commitment, you lose a lot of support. And I'll tell you this, as somebody who lives in Georgia, all 3 branches of government are controlled by Republicans. The way I try to explain to people is I am desperate to stop a Trump presidency, but I also needed people to understand that for better or for worse, the president came from a generation that did not see Palestinians as people. He has an empathy gap with us. It is real and it is pervasive. And I could give you example after example as somebody who tried to engage with the White House. I mean, engaging with the White House versus engaging with the Harris campaign has been night and day for us. And
Mm,
her ability to see people as people has been incredible. Now, to your point about Georgia and what that meant, it meant that suddenly we went from being like a very, very, very depressed electoral sort of group. My friend, I had somebody text me who said, like, they said, I knew you would do everything you could to stop Trump, but at least now it seems like you're not completely broken doing it. And that is the truth. Because again, as a Palestinian, as somebody who's done this for 10 years, literally 10 years, I told people this. I said, I've never missed an election. I have always voted. And when I thought about pressing that button next to Biden's name, Fair or not, all I could imagine was me pressing that button and a bomb dropping on a child in Gaza. That is how just closely interconnected that name and what we're seeing in Gaza became in a lot of our heads, even for me as a politically involved person. Um, and so that's why I've been urging people, particularly like the Harris campaign and others, of take a position of we just want you to enforce our laws. If somebody breaks our laws, they should not get our weapons. And we actually just had a poll come out yesterday, including Georgia, where 40% of likely voters, Democrat and independents, said that they would be more likely to vote for Harris if she committed to conditioning weapons related, like specifically within the boundaries of our law. So this is pervasive. It wasn't just the Biden debate. It wasn't just any of that. This has been sort of a damper on our organizing efforts for as long as it's been going on. And for the first time, we feel like we have a chance. And my hope, and I continue to urge the vice president's campaign, is like, please hear that. We're not asking for you to change 80 years of policy in a campaign. We're just asking for our laws to be enforced. And that has really shifted people's perspective on how to politically engage.
Yeah, I know one argument I kept seeing was that whatever the empathy gap that you refer to, it was not as bad as Trump. Trump would definitely sort of like
Yep.
do
Yep.
whatever you want, raise
Yeah.
like he had no concern with Palestinian people. And the argument there being that those are the options. So that almost took it off the table. In other words, like it would be better
Totally.
with Biden and then now
Yeah.
focus on other issues like abortion
Yeah.
rights and so forth. Um, was that not compelling, I presume, to a lot of younger people and voters? And could you explain why, perhaps?
Yeah, not even a little bit, because remember, if you yourself didn't lose family members, you knew someone who did, whether you're Palestinian or just an ally or just somebody who organizes in these coalitions and spaces. You knew some, like I know so many people, but one of them, she works with the Arab Americans for Biden group, helped fundraise millions of dollars for him in 2020. She has lost over 80 family members. This is very real for people. And I had nothing to say to her because the president would come out and say the death toll is made up. He would repeat like hoaxes that were coming out of Israeli right wing media. During the 100-day statement, refused to even mention the suffering of Palestinians. Anytime he spoke about Palestinians, it was Hamas. There was never any like just words alone. Like part of the reason people became so entrenched and angry is there, even in just words alone, there was no empathy until the very, very, very end. And even then, it took the uncommitted movement. It took so many things for him to go, wait a minute, I think too many people are dying and we should stop this. And even then, refusing to use any of the tools to apply pressure. And like to be clear, again, like I said at the beginning, Trump is worse. There is no denying that. But the difference for somebody is, for somebody who's specifically Palestinian, I want to be very clear, for someone who's specifically Palestinian or very, very attached to this, the question then became, well, if I have no chance of saving anybody that I love, what even is the point? And then they fell into this like nihilism and depression, which is a totally normal human emotion, right? Like it is totally normal for somebody to say, I have to make this decision for the betterment of like my family or whatever. And it is also very normal to say, what's the point of me making this decision if it still means somebody I love is still going to die because of weapons that I'm paying for with my tax dollars? And I hope people would learn a little bit more empathy here, because I think we're all working from a place of fear and frankly trauma. And sometimes that brings out the worst in us. But I always ask people this hypothetical. If you knew somebody gave a gun to another person who ended up killing somebody you love, think of the person that you love the most. In addition to obviously being angry at the person who shot that weapon, would you then not be angry at the person who gave them that gun, particularly after you told them they were going to do that? And I think that for a lot of people is literally how personal it is, because the executive branch is uniquely able to make unilateral decisions when it comes to foreign policy.
Um, and I suppose the complexity. So there's a sizable Jewish population in the Atlanta area, a lot of
Mhm.
Georgia. Not equating all Jews with
Yep.
Israel. I That's not a correct way of framing it, but at the same time, there's often a sense that for Biden or for Democrats, Republicans are in a situation of where, again, we can essentially ignore an entire, we don't care about this demographic being Palestinian Americans or Muslims, and we're going to just completely support, you know,
Yeah.
one side of this issue.
Yep.
But for Democrats, it becomes much more complex,
Yep.
right? And there's some perception that whenever empathy is expressed, it is at the either that you're somehow um, supporting Hamas or not um, showing sufficient concern for
Yeah.
Israelis
Yep.
or Jews who felt um, very much
Yeah.
threatened by what was happening. Um, when you've gone in those communities, I'm assuming you have, like, what, how do you frame that discussion? Because it is such a
Totally.
complex.
So the way I approach it is the following. As Democrats, we have a set, hopefully set shared values, right? Things like, peace and justice for all, protecting repro rights, all of those things, right? We can agree as a party, we care about those. And what I tell people is that when you are in a diverse coalition and you agree on these specific standards, you cannot make exceptions for one or the other, particularly if it comes at the expense of another part of your coalition. And what do I mean by that? If somebody says we need to keep sending bombs, and we know that so many Democrats were some of the first to turn against the Iraq war, it is incumbent upon us and our party to set boundaries. That is my point here. My point is like, and I tell people this all the time, it is not our job to say yes to everybody. That is actually not effective coalition building, but it is our job to protect our values and our stances across the board. And we should be applying our rules and laws for allies and foes alike. We do this with Ukraine. We do not allow Ukraine to bomb certain targets using our weapons. We place those considerations and restrictions on them. We should be doing the same here when it comes to Israel. And the sad reality of the situation is that there are people who unfortunately have completely convinced themselves that a hospital, for example, is a Hamas headquarters. They will share propaganda, they will spread the worst falsehoods. And then you hear from somebody on the ground and they're like, wait, this is not a weapons shaft. This is literally a water well. And there are like videos, and they'll send videos and write up all these reports, and people will do independent investigations. And like, but by that time that happens, people have moved along. But our job as leaders is to grapple with the hard things, particularly when it comes to issues of life or death, right? And so, like, just like for example, and you and I both know this, like in our communities, there are people who are very socially conservative who don't understand the abortion thing, will say things like, I don't understand why we're so focused on the LGBTQ people. That happens all the time. But our job isn't that we give up on those things because there are people who are conservative. Our job is to explain to them that the only way we protect each other is if we protect everybody's rights. And the only way to do that is by setting those boundaries. And my recommendation to people has been and continues to be that we do the same here. We anchor ourselves in the things that we know to be just and true and right. And we very kindly and emphatically and empathetically say, like, me saying, hey, we should stop bombing children is not detrimental to your safety. These are not mutually exclusive things. And on top of that, in addition to that, we now have Israeli intelligence, Israeli reporters, members of the Israeli political class that have told us the objective to destroy Hamas is not happening and cannot be met. And what we're seeing right now is collective punishment, mass starvation and mass bombing and mass displacement. 2 million people. Like, can you imagine 4 times the population of Atlanta suddenly being dispersed all around Georgia with nowhere to go? That is what we're talking about. And when we are having those difficult conversations, the reality is that it is our job as a party, it is our job as leaders to grapple with these things in a I still think we can be kind and gentle and sincere about it, but the line should be what's right and what's wrong.
This started, there was sort of the difficulty, I'd imagine, if you were a sort of standard liberal who, regardless, it's kind of like don't bomb kids or,
Mhm.
you know, suddenly there were charges of anti-Semitism directed towards you, which, you know, who cares? When I was a kid, when I was much younger, I didn't care if someone called me a commie, or during the
Yeah,
Iraq War, I didn't care if someone called me not patriotic, or, you know, that they gave me the freedom fries treatment or something. That didn't bother me. But being called anti-Semitic was somewhat chilling, because that is a
yeah,
horrible, it's a fundamentally horrible thing. And I think that's been part of, again, that sort of delicate
Yeah,
issue of like how do you express
totally.
empathy and express criticism for a nation without especially the Israeli government being equated with all Jews
Yep,
and even all Israelis seems strange to me. I know whenever I was in Europe during the George W. Bush administration, then later the Trump administration, um, the consistent theme from a lot of people had to be in cities where obviously neither of those presidents were very popular. They did not like those guys. They made clear they did not like those guys or those
yeah,
policies, but they made it so clear that they loved Americans. They
yep,
loved America and they
yep,
loved Americans in particular. That was like very clear
yeah,
balance. And to presume that if you didn't like Trump or you didn't like Bush, that you
yep,
hated America as a white Americans to die was often seen as a extreme unfair position. But now we're sort of seeing a version of that here with the Israeli government. And yeah, I mean, I'm not the politician, so I'm not sure how we kind of manage that
yeah,
tension, the tension that does exist within the parties. Would you agree?
absolutely. You know, and again, this kind of goes back to sort of how schisms appear and what they are, right? Like it is so to give you an example that happened here in Georgia, there was a bill that was presented called it was a defining anti-Semitism bill. The problem was there was a few like just on a technical level, the bill didn't have the definition itself. It actually sent people to a website. It also referenced the Trump executive order. I mean, there was just like from just a technical perspective, there's a lot wrong with the bill. But the specific definition the bill wanted to use was on a website. It's called the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism. And 7 of the 11 examples that they gave related to Israel. Some of them made total sense. Like if you equate the actions of Israel with somebody who's Jewish, that is absolutely anti Semitic. But one of the examples was if you call Israel a racist state, then you are anti Semitic. And people like me and others opposed it. We actually had a broad coalition. It included literally every faith under the sun, yes, including Jewish organizations. It was a multi generational, I mean, it was just such a beautiful coalition that came out and said, this is wrong. And what I had done to the bill authors directly to their faces, I actually offered advice and suggestions. I said, there's people like the Nexus Project working on this that do a better job of making sure their like definitions are legally sound. We offered alternatives, we offered whatever. The problem is there are absolutely people who are taking advantage of people's real fears about anti-Semitism and the real rise of anti-Semitism and are leveraging it to prevent legitimate criticism of the state of Israel. Because I'll tell you this, I am not anti Semitic for saying Israel is racist. Why? Because when I was there for 2 weeks, particularly in the West Bank, if I was profiled as a white convert, I was left alone. If I was correctly profiled as Arab, I had rifles pointed at my heart. And that is the difference. Literally, I experienced, like, I tell people all the time that visiting felt like going back in time to Jim Crow, but in the desert, because in the West Bank, it's Jim Crow in the South, but in Israel proper for Arabs, it's just Jim Crow in the North. And
Mhm.
that is the difference for people. And me saying that is not me being anti Semitic. It's me telling people there are laws on the books about this, there are discrepancies in policy about this. And so, what I tried really hard to do is keep my language as clear as humanly possible. And I made sure to also remind people because there were like folks putting these like awful little baggies with like really genuinely anti Semitic stuff, like messaging in them.
Mhm.
The bill actually would not have addressed that either. And I think it is, again, our job as elected officials and leaders to be very honest with the public about what we're doing, why we're doing it, and how we're doing it. Because I think that there are absolutely people who are being bad faith here and calling people rightfully pointing out the human rights abuses of the Israeli government and saying those are anti Semitic. And I think we should be ignoring those voices, to be quite honest. I think that they are taking a very real problem and concern, and and actually the part that people don't really talk about is when you do that, the signal to somebody who's uninformed is that the only way to oppose Israel is to also be anti-Jewish. And that actually makes it harder for those of us who are fighting against anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, homophobia, you name it, because what you're doing to our coalition is you're making it harder for us to draw clear distinctions because you are saying the distinctions don't exist. And when you say the distinctions don't exist, it makes it harder for the rest of us to fight them. And
Mhm.
like, I get why people do it. And I know that for some people, this is so personal. And the connection to Israel is so personal, but the reality is that we are still dealing with fallible leaders and a fallible government that is being incredibly unjust. And it is our job, again, as leaders, to deal with those complexities and not just take the easy way out because it's the easy way out. And lastly, I'll say this. If you look at when all of those Republicans were holding their like campus committee hearings and whatever the case may be, and they got those college professors to step down, it didn't matter. No matter what those college professors did, no matter how many of the bad faith attacks that they conceded to, it did not change the outcome for them. Because those individuals that are willing to muddy the waters this way do not actually care about me, you, members of the Jewish community, they don't care about any of that. For them, at the end of the day, it's about, like, I think there are some people who genuinely are like, this is my fight about anti-Semitism and like I really care about it, and they're not really into the law and stuff like that. But if you listen to people's speeches when they presented this bill, they specifically mentioned Palestinian protesters. They could have
Mm,
talked about the Nazis that were marching in our streets. They could have talked about the Nazis that were projecting stuff on our highways. They could have focused on all of those people. Instead, what happened is the authors of the bill focused on Palestinian protesters and pro Palestinian protesters. And on top of that, one of them, who's not even Jewish, kept saying so-called Jews about anyone in our coalition who was Jewish. And that included
mm,
people, by the way, from organizations like J Street and Trua. And so
mm.
and nobody called him out for his anti-Semitism, even though it is anti-Semitic. And that's my
Yeah.
point to people, is that we need to be really good about discerning those two things.
And that's anti-Semitism that Trump perpetuates with saying that any Jewish person who votes Democratic should have their head examined, or suggesting that the vice president's husband is a bad Jew, and so forth. And yes, I mean, it was obviously disingenuous from Republicans who have enabled a lot of anti-Semitism and right wing hatred. Though I think it's sort of a general sense of, to the extent that you are right wing, you are part of our family. If they have any sort of collective
Yeah.
identity, it is just if you are right wing. And I think that's again, when Trump was in office, or there was no question that this America had a right wing government, an extreme far right government that was doing
Yep.
some bad things. And I think it is very difficult, perhaps, to make the same claim about Israel, despite its prime minister being very much like Trump in certain ways. Um,
Mhm.
and I think that's probably the complexity. Or less, perhaps not that complex.
Yeah.
It's a challenge. I would ask, because I think some of our allies, again, when Trump was in office, and he's doing horrible things, doing racist things, or like child separation, those policies, I think the diplomacy was always sort of like, for good or for ill, or we won't call America, we have to say America's our ally. We love America, but again, it
Mhm.
Trump's policy specifically,
Mhm.
rather than anything else. Do you think it would help if the language is more targeted towards Netanyahu and not to Israel as a whole? Because America itself has
No,
problems with being called racist. It
I
refuses to
don't.
be called racist.
Yeah. No, I don't, because again, we're talking about systemic problems that Netanyahu is currently the face of, but he is not the only cause of. Remember, his entire coalition is a right-wing coalition. They are currently displacing Palestinians in the West Bank at a record rate, at alarming rates. We just had a Palestinian state representative from Illinois who was visiting family in Tormosaya, and the settlers had attacked the village, and he literally had to be evacuated. And so the idea that this is just like one person or one government or whatever the case may be, it's like, it's not an effective analysis and assessment, in my personal opinion, because what ends up happening is you forget the systemic problems and you think that if we just got rid of Netanyahu, then everything is going to work out. But that's not true. We have to understand how things work. Like, I'm somebody who believes that you have to understand how things work to fix them, right? And in this
Oh yeah.
situation, if you're not recognizing what's happening in the West Bank, if you're not recognizing the siege on Gaza, if you're not recognizing all of this stuff, and for example, the reason I'm really mad at Biden is because he continued Trump's policies. Trump is the architect of the Abraham Accords. And the biggest problem with the Abraham Accords was it posited that if they just worked with all the other Arab countries, they can basically force the Palestinians into submission and it would force the issue under control. The reality is that has never worked. Anytime you want to fix this issue and you ignore Palestinians, you end up time after time after time in an increasing cycle of violence. And in addition to that, we also have to remember that Netanyahu and his government had an official policy on the book called mowing the lawn, where they periodically bombed Gaza. That was an official policy that they bragged about. And on top of that, he facilitated cash transfers with the approval of his own government to Hamas. So it's not me funding them. It's not you funding them. It's not our government funding them. It's these people who need each other funding each other. And if we only focus on like individual people, we miss out on this sort of much bigger picture of like settlements, unfair laws, all that kind of stuff.
Sure. It is just a dilemma in America because, and I've written about this as well, like
Yeah.
we don't like stating that America is racist, even when America had laws that were explicitly racist. It's not just, I mean, you can't implement Jim Crow without
Yep.
federal coordination and approval
Yeah.
and people sort of being fine with that. It's not something, but it's a lot of sort of racism as a lone wolf theory has always been kind of the struggle of America, to the point, obviously years ago, Kamala Harris had to avoid stating that she believes what is, or even I think she would have to say was. Nikki Haley, of course, was saying it never even
Yeah.
was, while also bolstering her own bio with stories about overcoming racism. So that is
Totally.
that is sort of, I think, the struggle here. Yeah.
Yeah, and I will say our allies, for example, are not giving us $20 billion of weapons, right? Like they have every right to say whatever they want to say because they are not they're not like enabling anything, right? We don't need anybody to help us enable our policies. The difference with us here, and the reason it's so important to call it for what it is that we are enabling this. Like if we weren't enabling this and we just kept saying whatever we wanted to say, I would not care. But if we're enabling it, then the trade-off for that is you have to be honest. You can't kind of like play it both ways.
So obviously your primary was after October 7th. Was there
Mhm.
any again within the part, was there any challenges or differences campaigning or whatever in your experience with
I didn't even have opposition. You know, I'd like to remind people that as much as everyone wants to recreate politics and try to do it differently, the reality is that you show up for your community and there are the basic things people care about: education, healthcare, our civil rights, economic opportunities. And if you focus on those things, then you'll be okay. And I think obviously on Twitter, I talk a lot about this because that's the only place that I can make a difference. But the reality is that I was a freshman in the minority party that got a bill out of my chamber. I just ran out of time in the Senate. I'm somebody who really cares about the policy side of this. I didn't run to litigate international affairs because, to be quite honest, the only reason I agreed to run for this position is that it's not Congress. I would
Mhm.
not have had to deal with this. My grandfather had just died. I was not like, I think we forget sometimes that politicians are people, and I get why, and I totally get that. But this was not something I wanted to touch with a 10-foot pole because it is very painful for me. It is
Mhm.
painful because it's a daily reminder that he is not here. And I loved him, and he's like probably the person I was closest to in my family. And and so yeah, like at the end of the day, I just obviously big money plays a part in all of that, but the reality is so far nobody seems to hate me, and that's good.
That's great. Thank you so much for your time, Representative. And if you could, before we go, if there's anything you really want to press, of like you're very happy of having done or achieved at the local level, I'd love to sort of hear,
Yeah.
because people often kind of don't get, they do think it's about litigating big issues and big ideas and not sort of
Yeah.
the community work.
So much. Obviously, my Republican colleagues love talking about tax breaks and tax cuts. So one of the things I made sure to do is for the recent tax exemption policies that we passed, that there would be a little bit extra in there for first responders and teachers, so they can afford to live in the communities that they work in. Like I said, the bill that I got out was to designate EMS as an essential service. People don't know that we actually don't designate EMS as essential service because it's newer than law enforcement and fire, and so it never got sort of added into the typical jurisdictions and all of that sort of laws. And We fully funded the Hope Scholarship. Unfortunately, we did not pass Medicaid expansion, which is still a bummer. We actually were able to stop every single anti-LGBTQ bill this year. We stopped most anti-voting and most anti-immigrant bills this year as well. A couple of them slipped through, but when you're in a state like mine, the wins are you stop bills, you pass good bills, and both of those are actually equal amounts of good in our book, and we count those. And my hope is that this is why I tell people to focus locally, because the reality is, um, the more you support people like me locally, and the more you get more people like me elected locally, the more we can apply upward pressure, because we are in a pipeline. Like, there are going to be a lot of my colleagues in 2026. I was like checking the date, but in 2 years we're going to have the governor's race, right? A lot of those state representatives and state senators are going to leave to run for statewide offices. And the more that you build relationships with us and invest with us, the more that you can help us kind of hone that moral compass when it comes to politics, and make sure that as my colleagues sort of move higher up in their life or whatever they decide to do, that they are truly representing what we want. But I myself, as an elected official who likes to think I'm very well connected, even I can't know everything that you want without you telling me.
Well, thank you so much for your time, for coming on and chatting with me. I'm gonna include links to your site and on the in the show notes. Thank you so much for also sharing
Yeah.
your story and your history. I
Thanks for
appreciate it
having
so
me.
much. And everyone, please like, share, subscribe, and we'll catch you next time. Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye, everyone.